What's the difference between a vacuum cleaner and a lawyer on a motorcycle? The vacuum cleaner has the dirt bag on the inside.
Lawyer jokes.
And believe me, I have nothing but the utmost respect for your profession. I mean, it's a pillar of... Oh, why do they bury lawyers under 20 feet of dirt? Because deep down, they're really good people. Oh, what do you call a lawyer with an IQ of 60? Your Honor. What's the difference between a tick and a lawyer?
Oh, no.
The tick falls off when you're dead. Bam! Love that one. You like that?
I don't know what you're worried about. Jimmy's great.
Yeah. No, he's... Yeah. What do you call 25 attorneys buried up to their chins in cement? Not enough cement.
What? Oh.
If it's your first time here, hey, my name is Quentin. I'm a writer, teacher, and sometimes performer. Better Call Saul, the spin-off and prequel to Breaking Bad. You know, the show about a high school chemistry teacher manufacturing drugs to provide for his family, with the help of a certain criminal lawyer named Saul Goodman. If you haven't seen it, you should probably watch it now. Or better yet, start with Better Call Saul, then watch Breaking Bad. Or actually, scratch that. Don't watch anything right now except for this video essay. Better Call Saul follows the moral decline of lawyer Jimmy McGill, as we witness how people in his life, his tendency to scam, and the inaccessible world of law morph him into the criminal lawyer persona of Saul Goodman, who we first meet in Breaking Bad during its second season. In Better Call Saul, we also get some flash forwards to Saul's new life in hiding as Gene Takovic, following the end of both storylines. Better Call Saul celebrates its 10th anniversary this year, and since it's become my new favorite piece of narrative media, I thought it was time for a good old-fashioned analysis. If this video does okay, maybe I'll make more videos. But for now, I have an important question for you. Have you ever noticed the amount of electric lights and shot compositions in Better Call Saul? For those that have seen the show or know a little bit about it, you'll remember that Chuck McGill, Jimmy's older brother and the lawyer who inspires him to obtain his law license, has an intolerance to all forms of electricity, including the most utilized form of electrical power in modern society, artificial lights. It's really no coincidence that the show features consistent cinematic framing of electrically powered lights above or even near characters, especially when it comes to composing a shot with Jimmy McGill, a charismatic electric character, you could say, on his way to becoming someone even more electric. In this video essay, I'm going to be focusing only on the first episode, Uno, and the significance of electric lights being framed in shot compositions throughout the episode, while also making some reference to the series in general. Let's do it. First, we have to talk briefly and broadly about the cultural meanings applied to lights, both natural and artificial. Now comes the really pretentious part of the video. Yay! Since the birth of visual consciousness, see what I mean about it being pretentious? We have been enchanted by light. Light from the sunrise, light from the stars in the sky, light from a fire, light from a lamppost, and nowadays, light from our devices. We've come to ascribe various ideas and meanings to the phenomenon of light in Western culture, and these various ideas and meanings go way, way back. As stated in the article Representations of Light in Western Culture, quote, just as light in the Old Testament is used to symbolize goodness, righteousness, and wisdom, so darkness in turn symbolizes not just the absence of light, but often the presence of evil, end quote. And furthermore, quote, the Old Testament contains a plethora of instances in which light represents sanctity, goodness, wisdom, and justice, end quote. So light, particularly natural light from the sun, stars, and fire, was generally viewed as a symbol for these values of sanctity, goodness, wisdom, and justice. Of course, darkness, even nowadays, conveys the opposite of these values. To come into the light is to be good, to be cast into darkness is to be bad. When the Enlightenment period took place in the late 17th century with these monumental political, intellectual, and societal changes, the meaning of light changed too. In fact, it was the Enlightenment period which indirectly led to the invention of artificial light that we use today. Light went from being associated with religious, sacred ideals to being associated, quote, with independent thought, with reliance on one's own wits, but also with bravery and rebellion, end quote. Now on the surface, these ideas from different time periods of Western cultural history seem obvious. We still associate light with goodness, intelligence, independence, wisdom, and even justice. But do you notice how the ideas associated with light in biblical times were pretty morally certain? Sanctity, goodness, wisdom, justice. Pretty obvious where this moral certainty was coming from. Religious belief, in particular, Christianity. Now look at the ideas associated with light in the Enlightenment era. Independent thought, bravery, rebellion, the reliance on one's own wits. Are these attributes as morally certain as the attributes that came before? Not completely. Independent thought is only as good or useful as the thoughts themselves, and whether people use their capacity for these thoughts for selfish, destructive purposes or more altruistic, moral purposes. Bravery sounds good, but bravery can also be quite relative. For example, people on conflicting sides of the political spectrum can call themselves brave since they believe they are morally sound and standing up for their cause. But their acts of bravery would appear morally unsound or even violent to an opposing side. Rebelling against something unjust or using one's wits to get out of a situation sounds great, but yet again, it's relative depending upon the person's motivation, the actions they take, and what consequences result from those actions. The meanings we assign to light in our age could be assumed to constitute a mixed bag of these past ideas and attitudes. We still highly value natural light, in part because of the meanings initiated by our ancestors, but many of us can't stand artificial light from the screens that we're all addicted to. Yet, we use this type of artificial light every day and still find a lot of value in it. Light is both good and bad, so ultimately, morally gray. And you could say the same about law. The rule of law can be used morally, and it can be abused immorally. Now, how does this relate to Better Call Saul? Well, I think that the use of electric lights in the show represents many thematic, philosophical, or even societal ideas. But what I think the electric lights are specifically meant to symbolize in regards to the brotherly feud and relationship between Chuck and Jimmy is each brother's attitude towards the legal profession. In particular, Chuck's supposed hypersensitivity to anything electrically powered, following Jimmy becoming a certified lawyer, really communicates this difference in their personal attitudes towards law, especially when you consider how Chuck's illness gets worse each time Jimmy does something electric or colorful. But this difference in attitude as represented by electric lights ultimately serves to visually demonstrate our protagonist's central conflict. More on that later. Now, if I were to list these light ideas, pun intended, which set sounds more like Jimmy, Saul Goodman, McGill, and which sounds more like Charles, the law is sacred McGill? You got it. Chuck harbors a more Old Testament outlook on light as a symbol for the world of law, whereas Jimmy harbors a more post-Enlightenment outlook on light, hence why he's constantly framed under an electric light source, whereas Chuck is shrouded in darkness and natural light. It's as if Jimmy is one with the modern era, whereas Chuck confines himself to the past. Chuck works for the law, whereas Jimmy makes the law work for him. If the law as some beacon of light in the world is no longer conceivable as good, sacred, or just, since it allowed his morally flexible brother to enter, then surely electric lights must be the problem. Classic psychological sublimation, am I right? Light as a symbol for the law and its potential to do good or to do harm is no longer morally certain, but now morally gray. The law has become too electric for Chuck to handle. But for Jimmy, the law is just not electric enough. So now let's look at how shot compositions in the first episode of Better Call Saul visually tells us this distinction between the two brothers, by primarily focusing on how the creators frame and compose shots of Jimmy McGill. Don't worry though, we'll come back to Chuck. He's everyone's favorite after all, right? Everybody loves Chuck. He's everybody's favorite character, am I wrong? But first, we have to quickly define two related but different cinematic terms, framing and composition. Framing is the proportions of what we see on a screen, the specific angle or point of view we see things from. A POV shot or an over-the-shoulder shot is an example of framing. Think of it as a formal element, how something is communicated in film. Composition is what we see within that frame, the people, objects, shapes, or settings. Keeping electrical lighting sources within the dimensions of a shot dictated by the framing in Better Call Saul is an example of shot composition. Think of it as the element of content, what is communicated in film. Now, throughout this analysis, I'll mainly refer to composition as opposed to framing. Framing is an important aspect, considering that shots need to be framed a certain way in order to accommodate the creative choices in composition, but what we're really concerned with are the content of the shots as opposed to the form of the shots. Now, we can truly get started. Major spoiler warning for Better Call Saul, in particular this very first episode. Viewer beware. Now I could go through the entire episode and point out all the various shots of Jimmy nearby or directly under an electric light, and all the contrasting shots where he's bathed in natural light, but I thought I would just focus on 7 in the interest of time. Each of these electric shots, if you will, I have a lot of puns in this video, is typically followed by a contrasting non-electric shot in the scene that follows, with each contrasting pair usually indicating Jimmy being his electric self within his legal work, and then Jimmy trying to, or being forced, to tame his electric self within his legal work or within his disposition to others. Now, as we discuss these compositions, keep in mind the meanings associated with light in the Enlightenment age: independent thought, bravery, rebellion, and the reliance on one's own wits. And also keep in mind the meanings associated with light in the biblical age: sanctity, goodness, wisdom, and justice. Now, our first introduction to lawyer Jimmy McGill takes place in the courthouse bathroom. He's in the process of rehearsing his defense for a case where a group of 19-year-old boys desecrated a corpse in a morgue. Notice in this first full body shot, he's lit completely by natural light from the bathroom window. It's implied he's a bit nervous. Maybe this is one of his first PD cases, or maybe he's attempting to play it straight instead of being performative, charismatic, rebellious. In other words, instead of being electric. After all, here we have no electric light sources at all, only natural light from the sun. We contrast this brief sequence with a tracking shot of Jimmy performatively bursting into the courtroom and beginning his defense, all the while with electric light sources right above him, illuminating a path forward in this difficult case. As Jimmy provides his defense, trying to appeal to the nostalgic longings of the jury and questioning the prosecution's evidence.
Do you remember 19? Let me tell you, the juices are flowing. The red corpuscles are corpuscling. The grass is green and it's soft, and summer's gonna last forever. Now the prosecution keeps bandying this term, criminal trespass.
The shot is framed so that we can see electric lights right above Jimmy as he eloquently and charismatically speaks. It's like he said to himself, fuck it, I'm gonna be electric instead of playing it by the books. Now we have him surrounded by electric lights instead of the previous sunlight as he uses his skills to defend his clients. After losing this case and failing to obtain the high-profile Kettleman embezzlement case, Jimmy returns to the nail salon. That's right, his solo practitioner office is right in the back of a nail salon. Not very glamorous. He walks in, addressing the customers and the workers in what I assume is mispronounced Vietnamese. As you can see, the composition features electric lights right above Jimmy, as the owner demands that he confirm.
You work for people who have sex with chopped off head?
And Jimmy responds with,
Was it in the paper?
I heard it from my cousin. Why? Why you work for these people?
Just lucky, I guess.
This exchange, both in the dialogue and the visual presence of electric lights, implies that Jimmy's defending of these people is improper in the eyes of civilized law and society. But Jimmy doesn't agree with Mrs. Nguyen, nor does he try to overly defend himself. Instead, he makes a sarcastic remark, demonstrating his independence and his ability to rely on his wits, despite judgment from the very person who is allowing him to rent space for this electric law practice. Following this disapproval from his landlady over his legal clientele, Jimmy sits in the sad, dimly lit back office. Here we see no visible electric light sources, except some gleam in the wall's reflection. Now this stands in direct contrast to the shot before. When Jimmy walked in, the ceiling above had visible lights. Now, confined to his cramped office, there are no electric lights above him. His electric light, his own use of the law, first switched on in his courtroom defense, has blown a fuse, if you will, after losing a case, failing to obtain a high-profile case, and being scolded for the types of cases he's taking. Jimmy just can't catch a break, it would seem. Now we come to Jimmy returning to his electric flare in the conference room of Hamlin, and McGill, HHM. This shot is impossible to ignore. It's not only my favorite shot from the entire episode, and maybe even the entire series, but it so clearly demonstrates the visual motif of pairing Jimmy McGill with electric sources of light. There's even a bit of excitement on his face as he walks into the conference room and sees this path of lights before him. After a beat, he grabs the attention of the staff.
You have meddled with the primal forces of nature, Mr. Hamlin, and I won't have it!
He then proceeds to encourage Howard Hamlin, one of the senior partners at the firm, to buy his brother out, which he first initiates by sprinkling the tattered check onto the table. A very performative way to get his point across. Now, Jimmy isn't in lawyer mode here, but he is behaving quite independently and rebelliously, as he's surrounded by stiffer, play-by-the-rules type lawyers. Though Howard, and especially Kim, turn out to not be as stiff as this pilot leads us to believe. Furthermore, he's also surrounded by these desk lamps. Not only is Jimmy behaving colorfully, or rather electrically, with these lamps nearby, but the very reason that he's in this room is to encourage Howard to buy out his brother, who has developed a hypersensitivity to electricity and hasn't set foot in the firm since. The irony being that Chuck's issue with electricity is really an issue with Jimmy being a lawyer. In this scene, Jimmy doesn't realize yet that Chuck has been barring him from practicing at HHM, and Howard doesn't realize that Chuck's allergy to electricity is a manifestation of a personal issue with the electric way Jimmy treats the law, at least in Chuck's eyes. So this cut to Howard saying,
I, for one, believe he's gonna lick this thing,
is truly visually and verbally ironic. If anyone needed any more evidence that composing carefully framed shots of Jimmy nearby electric lights was intentional, look no further than the fact that Jimmy begins to leave the room within the same framing as he entered it.
Son of a bitch.
ground yourself.
Yes, I grounded myself.
Jimmy certainly has to ground himself now that he's about to talk with Chuck. He not only physically has to remove all of his electronic devices, but he has to behave a bit less colorfully, a bit less electrically. Jimmy does come across more grounded in this scene. You can tell that he truly cares about his brother and generally leaves behind the electric behavior he displayed at HHM as he earnestly encourages Chuck to collect his financial share. Now in this shot, we do have some visible light sources in frame, but these are not electric lights. They're gas-powered lanterns. The only tolerable sources of light Chuck can handle come from more natural sources, the sun, or the fire from a lantern. As mentioned before, these natural light sources harken back to more biblical conceptions of light, and I argue that each brother's tolerance, or lack of tolerance for light, is meant to represent how they conduct themselves as lawyers, because light is a symbol for the rule of law as we know it. Chuck is simply a different kind of lawyer. He can only handle morally certain conceptions and practices of the law, as represented by his toleration of only natural light. Electric light sources generally harken back to Enlightenment conceptions of light. Jimmy, he's a slippery kind of lawyer, thriving on moral flexibility and his own wits within the law, as represented by all of these shots featuring electric lights, and the fact that each time things don't go his way, he's normally away from electric lights, away from his power source, you might say. Now, to bring this all together, let's look at one of the last shots in Uno. After Jimmy's scheme to win the business of Craig and Betsy Kettleman doesn't go according to plan, he falls into the hands of one Tuco Salamanca. In this extreme low angle, we see Jimmy's frightened expression, Tuco's gun, and an electric porch light, all in the same composition. Here is the ultimate culmination of this leitmotif. Jimmy used his more electric ways to plot a scheme to obtain a high-profile case, only for it to blow up in his face. I'm a poet. He's right near an electric light source, but the light is off. He's both with and without electricity. His electric way of conducting himself in this business/world of law has failed. It's like his power has died. But only for now. So you might be asking yourself, why does any of this matter? Why am I going on and on and on about lights? It's because of what the lights represent. Even without paying attention to the visual motif of electric lights, it's pretty clear that Jimmy is a very different person and a very different lawyer compared to Chuck, something which is only further demonstrated as the series continues. But there's an ongoing debate amongst viewers of the show as to whether Jimmy would have become Saul Goodman if his brother had just given him one chance to prove himself. Chuck wouldn't have even developed any psychological issues with electricity if he just accepted his brother's electric nature, or better yet, stopped actively insisting that,
I know what you were. What you are. People don't change. You're Slippin' Jimmy. And Slippin' Jimmy I can handle just fine, but Slippin' Jimmy with a law degree is like a chimp with a machine gun.
Was Jimmy always destined to turn out how he did? Or could he have been a responsible, respectable lawyer if given the opportunity and the support? Would Jimmy have even wanted to infuse some morally flexible electricity into the sacred, uptight lawyer world, if not for Chuck shutting him out of his firm? After all, who can blame Jimmy for trying to bend the rules to get a high-profile case as a struggling solo practitioner? Or maybe Jimmy was always going to abuse the law via his electric nature, with or without Chuck's encouragement. The answer is probably somewhere in the middle. This difference in attitude towards law as represented by these electric lights ultimately serves to visually demonstrate Jimmy McGill's central conflict. that no matter how hard he tries to play it straight and overcome his reckless past and be a respectable lawyer, the larger world, the people he tries to please, and his own impulses will keep insisting that he doesn't belong, that he can't change, that he's not a real lawyer. And when someone feels this lack of belonging, they look for other ways to fit in, or they go their own way. They follow their own path, even if that path might be a bad one. Jimmy's pathway to finding himself in the law was lit by electric lights, and it ultimately led him to Saul Goodman. Everything I just said is only my personal opinion and analysis, so if you disagree with me, please tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear it. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe.
I do have a problem. Just not the problem you think. I have a Jimmy McGill problem.
Jimmy McGill?
You'll have to excuse me.